cognitive evolution. My whole, how do you say, you gotta help me with the French, raison
d'être.
Reason for living, right?
Reason to be.
Reason to be. Is really cognitive evolution. I got into developmental psych so that I could do conceptual development, so I could apply that to cognitive evolution. My undergrad's in anthropology. I did a year of graduate work in brain and behavioral evolution, and I kept taking psych courses to learn more about neuropsychology and psych processes. And the more I did that, it ended up that studying fossil brains was only going to get you such a teeny, it was great cooperative evidence, but you're not going to find out anything really about human behavior or neurology by studying fossil brains. And there's plenty of guys doing that, doing really well. And just studying straight psych isn't going to help either, or doing cognitive psych. As you do cognitive psych, you're going to figure out how many words we can memorize in 20 minutes or something like that. And that's not going to help you with these guys either. So I ended up doing developmental psych and conceptual development. And I did that to figure out what are some of the elements of cognition that happen that are pre-verbal, and what's the sequence of how kids learn things during their conceptual development. Can that shed any light or show any logical constraints for how those same things would have evolved, right? So these guys had to discover what we all go through from age, 1 year to age 14, when we're thinking pretty much like adults, right? We learn it from our cultures, and it's already wired in. These guys had to discover all those concepts for the first time, okay? So that's kind of the approach I take. So we're going to look at some archaeology, and then I'm going to try and make some sense out of it from developmental and cognitive psychology. I go back to my old hero every time, Jacob Bernowski. This is a quote from his book, The Ascent of Man, that he's reading there. It's a fantastic 12 episode series from PBS from the mid-70s. And if you ever get a chance to look at it, I've got a copy if you want it. The Ascent of Man is fantastic. It's philosophy of science, it's history of science, really excellent. And he kind of takes a developmental approach that just merely observing the world isn't enough. That by constructing the world, by taking it apart and putting it back together, is how we really understand how the world works. Well, I think that's a good metaphor for how we developed our unique cognition. Because we do things no other animal does, and I think we built that through primarily manufacturing tools. And I want to qualify that, manufacturing tools, not just using tools. There's dozens of different species that use tools. Corvids, like ravens and crows, are very clever animals, and they can pick up a stick and they can fish a grub out of a tree trunk, or they can bend a paper clip and insert it into a trap and fish out a morsel of food. They're not stupid, they're very clever, but they're never going to build you a skyscraper or make you a hamburger either. Okay? Same thing with chimps. Chimps are very clever at some kinds of problem solving. I already talked about this in the last lecture. They're not real bright at social cognition type stuff. Your dog is a genius at social cognition, almost as good as a 2-3-year-old, and they both leave a chimp in the dust. Okay? And chimps use tools. They fish for termites, they can fish for honey, they can crack nuts, they can do some pretty interesting tool using, and you see that throughout the animal kingdom, but nobody manufactures tools, and I think that's the key, and I'll try and make sense of that through this lecture. First thing we got to talk about, here's Lucy at the end there, about 3.3 million years ago. One of the interesting things about Lucy, besides the fact that she's fully bipedal, she only stands about this tall, but from the neck down, post-crania, under the cranium, right, she is a bipedal. She's more human than she is primate-like. She's got human hips, legs that she does not need like we are, whereas chimps are, when they waddle like this. Lucy walks in a straight line like we do. She's got feet like ours. Her toes, her big toes, are straight in line like ours. They don't stick out like an ape. Okay? This is a bipedal creature. But she's still got a brain the size of a chimp or a gorilla, about 400 cc's, and she's still got a very primitive ape-like face and big, huge teeth. The teeth are starting to reduce already, but she's more primate than human. Okay? If you look at something 1 million or 2 years later, you see the teeth, they're starting to look much more human. The face is much smaller. It's tucked in instead of sticking out. Lucy's face sticks way out like the muzzle of your dog or chimp's. Okay? So Lucy didn't make any tools. Okay? Lucy was around 3.3 to 3.6 million years ago. We won't see any tools for at least another million years. And maybe they'll find some, but there's been an awful lot of paleoanthropology done in the last 30 years in deposits that are 3.3, 3.5 million years ago, a lot. And nobody's found any tools. We don't find any tools until 2.6 million years ago. So the interesting thing is, this is a picture of a human hand, and this is Lucy's hand. You get an idea how small it is. The key thing to look at is look at how long the thumb is, okay? And here's a model of a small Lucy standing there in a museum with a woman holding the hand. Look at the size of that thumb, okay? Lucy's hand is probably 80–90% on the way to looking fully human, okay? Now, this is a model of a chimp hand. Look at that little bitty thumb down there, okay? And chimps have got these big long fingers, so if you look at this chimp hand here, here's the bones of it. The fingers are much longer, they're very pointed at the end, they don't end in finger pads like ours, okay? And the thumb is really skinny. Look at the size of the chimp thumb versus the human thumb, okay? The bone is much more robust, it's much bigger. We have this huge pad of muscle here that chimps don't have, it's very rudimentary. So imagine, take your thumb and go like this, and then pretend it's only as big as your little finger, okay? And then extend your fingers each about an inch. And imagine what it's like trying to grip a hammer or do anything other than, swing through the trees. Chimps can do some minor stuff like crack rocks and stuff, but if you watch them when they do things, they don't have the hands for it, and they can't throw projectiles very well, again, because of that rudimentary thumb. They can't even bring their fingers all the way across like we do when we grip something, okay? Lucy, no tools, no stone tools. What was she doing with that hand? And none of the paleoanthropology literature talks about this. And I really want to talk to some of the guys that are involved in this stuff. There's been some excellent physical anthropology analysis of the hand. You can read excellent monographs by Mary Martsky out of University of Arizona. She's analyzed the hell out of it and how much it can grip and what it can do. But nobody talks about what was Lucy doing. Was she working a digging stick, and that hand went from the normal primate, chimp-like looking thing that evolved more toward a human? Because here's a fully modern human hand, and here's Australopithecus sediba, which is a recent find, and you can see the hand is almost identical to modern human, and that's around this 2 million, just before 2 million years.
I'm going to throw a monkey wrench in.
Go.
We always assume that the chimp hand is the primitive hand, but not the case.
True.
Chimps have been evolving for 8 million years too.
It's derived too, but
it's derived too. What does Ardipithecus hand look like? Yeah.
Ardipithecus hand is more like this, and it even has the thumb kind of divergent, so is the big toe.
Really?
So Ardipithecus at 4.3 million years, million years older than Lucy, okay, is bipedal, but it's kind of a mix of primate and bipedal features. And good point about the chimp. Yeah, the chimp is derived. The chimp knuckle walks, so do gorillas. No other apes do that. We never went through that. That's a derived feature, okay? Ardipithecus didn't knuckle walk. We know that for sure, okay? But this type of hand morphology, okay, that even a chimp has, that's more general primate-like. If you go back to the primate line, the hand's going to look like this. It's not going to look like a human hand. And yet, Lucy's hand was already leaving the primate structure and coming towards human. Nobody talks about why, and I'm real curious. Was she doing some sort of manipulating things with digging sticks and other things? Chimps, termite fish and crack nuts. Was Lucy doing that? Probably. You can almost guess she was. But we don't have any evidence beyond that. So that always strikes me that why, and the key thing is, without the human hand, we wouldn't have the human brain. We had to have the human hand first. Okay. So here's a short human evolution milestone thing. There's a dozen species in between here I'm not even going to talk about because we'd spend all night. So 6 to 7 million years ago was the common ancestor of the ape, lion, and us. Okay. We share a common ancestor with chimpanzees about 6 to 7 million years ago. Gorillas and orangutans split off a little earlier than that. Ron was just talking about Ardipithecus ramidus, that's about 4.4. Then, important for us is Lucy. We've just been talking about her, Australopithecus afarensis. And then about 1.8 million, around that time or a little earlier, we have our genus, Homo. Now there's some Homo habilis from about 2 point something, but there's arguments over that it looks very Australopithecine-like. It's got long arms and stuff. And now that they found that other one I showed you, that really nice hand, Sediba, that's older than the Homo, but it looks more Homo-like than Homo, so they're going to have to reclassify stuff. For sure, we have Homo erectus, this guy, and he's a little later version. This is actually from about 1 million years ago in Asia. But we have Homo erectus in Africa. All these critters are all evolved in Africa. Okay. Around this time, some of the Homo erectus left Africa and got as far as like southern Russia, Georgia, and stuff. There's some really interesting specimens. Then the other guy I've got in here is archaic Homo sapiens. And around 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern-looking Homo sapiens showed up. Okay, and the differences are, let's forget Lucy for a minute, but even just looking at erectus, you have these huge brow ridges. Okay, and this is only about 1,000 cc brain. Okay, Homo sapiens is 12 to 1,400. Actually, this one's about 800. This is around 1,000 to 1,200. This is a modern human is 12 to 1,400 cc's. Okay, so brain evolution goes along, increases over time. So do the tools and everything else. So that's the human evolution scale we're going to work with. Now I'll talk about the tools. This crude chopper that I made myself. Thank you. I butchered a chicken with it. Hey, that's about the level of my skill too. They're called Oldowan choppers and flakes because they were first found at Olduvai Gorge. Okay, so we call them Oldowan. They're the simplest tools we have. They show up about 2.6 million years ago in Ethiopia, and you have this chopper left over, but you can see where we took off these big hunks of flakes. Those flakes, the first flakes that come off are really, really sharp, and you can do a lot of defleshing with them. We have cut marks on bones that they were defleshing horses and other animals. They were scavenging things. They might have been hunting as well, but they were definitely using this thing as a butchering instrument, and probably shaving, digging sticks, and doing various other things with it. The next big jump is to this one at 1.8 million, associated with this guy. It's an early Australian hand axe. It's crude. It's an advance over this, and I'll tell you about the study I did this weekend that we're trying to take into just how advanced it is. Then you get down all the way another 1 million years later. So there's like 1 million years where all you see is the Oldowan tools. There's a huge gap. Then you get to the early hand axes, and you got another 1 million years or more before you see a really marked improvement, and that's these, where this takes some real technical flaking skill. It's very symmetric. This is first evidence of symmetry, which I think is one of the first evidence of any sort of abstract concept. It may be very implicit, but the human brain was starting to latch on to abstract concepts by that time. Around the same time, about 400,000 or 500,000 years ago, we do have wooden thrusting spears that are built like javelins. These guys might have been throwing them, but we know at least they were skewering animals with them. Okay? You don't see any kind of hafted tools until about 200,000 years ago, where you take something and bind it onto a piece of wood and make a spear point out of it. Okay? And it's not till 150,000 years later, and about 40,000 years ago, do we see all the elements of modern human culture show up. Okay, now bits and pieces show up 70 and 100,000 years ago, but not the whole package. By the time you get here, and I'm going to make a real case for this cave art thing, you get incredible representational art. They're working on bone. Everything prior to this is all on stone. We know they did wood tools, but no bone, no ivory, no antler. Okay, so they're doing bone, they're making needles out of bone, they're making harpoons out of bone, they're making antler hammers, there's carving on ivory. They make, like I said, harpoons, needles. You see flutes around this same time, atlatls, which is a spear thrower. And this is when you first see definite, consistent hearths, okay, where they were cooking regularly. There's some evidence going back, but even the guys back here that made these incredibly symmetric tools, there's no evidence of villages. They didn't live in huts regularly. You rarely find a hearth. So these guys were living in the wild like an animal, sleeping in the ground or up in the trees, but they had the skill to make this thing. not much else, okay? They didn't make any needles, so we know they didn't have any clothing, right? All that's gonna come, you know, 400,000 years later. It's wild, it's really interesting. So I'll get into all this bit by bit. Here's a picture, this is the actual thing, these are fake, right? How did I get that Facebook thing done? Everybody know?
Off of there?
You move your mouse.
Oh, okay, awesome, thank you. Because it's on one but not the other. All right, these are tools from the Field Museum in Chicago. I went there 5-6 years ago as a grad student to study, probably more like 7 years ago, to study this tool and a whole group of them like this that I knew were there. The guy had studied some years ago and he had looked at the symmetry of them, and then nobody took it up after that. So I went to see these knowing there'd be 300,000-year-old tools there, okay? And they had shelves of them. You go in the back of the museum, 90% of the museum is not out on display, it's back in the bowels in the museum. And if you're an archaeologist, you know, I'm walking through shelf upon shelf upon shelf of all these tools. Most of these are all from Europe, and they date to Neanderthal and later times, you know, 100,000 years or less. Just racks and racks of them all over the place. It's incredible. So I'm going through, and I find one little box on one shelf marked Olduvai. And Olduvai Gorge in Africa, okay, these aren't European tools, these are African. And Olduvai dating is like 1 million to 2 to 3 million years old. So I opened this thing and it had this Olduvai chopper and a couple of these guys. And it had the site numbers on them, so then I could look up in the literature and see where these tools came from and what the dating is. So I come back the next day, and I had one of the museum people take a picture of me. When you go in the museum, they make you wear the white lab coat, right? You know, because then you get to go back off and I'm a scientist, right? So they make you wear gloves so that you're not getting your finger oils on the specimens, whatever you're handling. So I had her take a picture of me holding these two hand axes because these suckers are 1.3 million to 1.5 million years old. And I still get chills talking about it. It's weird. I knew I was going to see stuff that there was 300,000 years that somebody made. Some human made these 300,000 years ago. That's phenomenal. But then when I find these, you know, I thought I'd have to fly to Africa to ever touch anything like that. But here they are, just one box of them at the Field Museum. So these are hand axes that very similar to this one here that date to just about 1.5 million. I'm glad she took a shot like this when I had the coat on because you could probably see my pants were wet. So what do we want to learn about all these tools? So this box, there's the Olduvai chopper like the one there. This is an actual early Acheulean hand axe, about 1.3 million to 1.5 million. These are all 300,000, 100,000 and less. And you can see the high skill that you can see in these. I had flint knappers this weekend make, two different guys make 2 of these, and 1 or 2 of these. And we're going to analyze it for the conceptual differences in this tool making process. And I'll talk more about that later. So one of the big issues in human evolution is, why did the tools stay the same for nearly 1 million years? And when you talk to any archaeologists, they're usually like, I don't get it. Why did they make these stupid Olduvai choppers? You know, why didn't they start making these right away? And then 1 million years later, they start making these, and they figure out how to make a hand axe. Why didn't they make them better? Why did it take another 1.5 million years to get that much better? Okay, so that's been a big issue for a long time. Why do you have this tool stasis for over 1 million years? Okay, and I'm going to try and explain that from a developmental standpoint that it's not so crazy. The second thing is what's called the sapient paradox. Here we have a modern human in physical form, okay? It's a 1400 cc brain, very small face. It goes straight down, big forehead. I mean, even look at archaic Homo or Homo erectus. These guys have like no forehead, big brow ridges. The face sticks out, dentition is bigger. We've got this tiny little sort of jaws and teeth, okay? This is fully anatomically modern human, and he shows up 150 to 200,000 years ago. But it's not until 40,000 years ago that we see flutes and cave art and all the things of modern human behavior. So that's the sapient paradox. Why do we have another 100,000 years before this guy starts acting like any modern human son of hunter-gatherers? You know, why is there this gap? Okay. Well, before I go to developmental and cognitive psych, we're going to go biology first. Ben, I guarantee you, Ron, I'm the only person in the world that can get a possum and Lenny Bruce on the same slide and somehow tie it together.
Somehow not get arrested.
I'm going to work on it.
Not get arrested, right?
Yeah.
They're having more fun in the other room. You hear the music?
Are they jamming?
And they have food, too.
They have food?
Let's
get some more food.
One day we go to a new room.
Comparative aside, why did the tools not change? Well, let's look at the possum. Maybe you can answer this. The possum is an incredibly dumb creature. It has a brain about the size of a chicken liver. It's smooth. It looks like a chicken liver. It really does. Okay? This is not a very bright animal. Okay?
Is that a correct, a precise scientific term?
Lisencephalic. Is that what you want? Lisencephalic?
No, number two there, dumb.
Dumb?
Is that a precise scientific term?
Very. Yeah. The possum teeth is how it makes its living, right? It's an insectivore, it goes out at night, doesn't have any really natural predators, nobody bothers the possum. They only live like 2 years or something like that.
Automobiles.
Automobiles, yeah, nowadays, right? But they're still all over, right? Where did they evolve? They evolved in North America. The North America and South America split, right? And so you have marsupials in Australia and in South America. Then when, what is it, when the Isthmus of Panama,
3 million.
3 million years ago, sea levels dropped and the Isthmus of Panama stuck up and the possums wandered up through Central America and up and back into North America. Okay, so that's why we have possums, the only marsupial animal around, right? They make their living with their teeth. You can go out with Bob Martin and go out to the Badlands or Wyoming, different areas, and dig up 55-million-year-old possum fossils, and the teeth are damn near identical to the one that just died in your backyard or on the road out front, right? Why? Same adaptation, no pressure to get smarter, right? Its teeth haven't processed for millions of years. Why? They haven't changed. Because it works. If you fill a niche and there's no selective pressure to change, you can see long stasis. Well, what I'm saying is these older one tools, they can extract marrow out of bones, they can deflesh animals, okay? They can cut digging sticks, they can do all kinds of things. This worked fine. They were a successful critter with this adaptation. They didn't have big canines or sharp teeth for cutting into flesh, okay? These guys used tools in place of their teeth, and it worked fine for 1 million years. There was no giant cognitive pressure for them to change. So was it pressure that changed them to figure out the hand axe, or was it just 1 million years of banging on rocks? Did we get a fortuitous extra column of brain cells mutation that allowed them to think of this or see it? I don't know. I can't get into that detail yet. But it's not crazy that something didn't change for 1 million years. It's common in biology. Okay? And the same thing with the next ones. And the example of that is if it cooks, right? If it works, you know, it doesn't need to change. So thank you, Lenny, for if it cooks. Okay. Now we get to development. This is my field. Cognitive development doesn't happen all of a sudden. You look at an infant, a 10-month-old infant that hasn't said its first word yet. It just figured out a month ago that objects are permanent and that they exist when they can't see them, and it'll look for a hidden object. Can't see any words yet. It can recognize inanimate from animate objects. It's just learned to recognize mom from others, you know, and caregivers, and show stranger anxiety when you're trying to give a 9-month-old baby to somebody else. It's probably going to cling, whereas a 6-month-old doesn't care. You know, one person taking care of him is just like another. So there's all these things, but that 9-month-old, 10-month-old infant doesn't know his name. You know, maybe he's going to start to respond to his name pretty soon, but he doesn't have any of the self-consciousness we take for granted. Kids don't recognize themselves in a mirror for another 2 years. You know, things like that. So everything that goes on with children, all of the conceptual development that we think of and take for granted the way we think as an adult, that kid's got to build it step by step over almost 14 years before it's thinking and operating like a fully cognitive adult, okay? All these things don't just come together at once. Just because one thing is there, something else doesn't pop up. It may not show up for another 3 years, okay? Kids can speak in sentences at age 3 and 4, but they can't add. You know, they can maybe do their numbers a little bit, but they got to learn all the different details of numbers. They've got to learn ordinality, cardinality, all those kind of things none of us can even explain, but they learn it step by step, and then they can add, and then they can do things. So if you look at it from a developmental standpoint, okay, this stuff just doesn't, just because they learn to flake stone, doesn't mean they're suddenly going to do all this and know symmetry and make needles the next day. So from a developmental perspective, this taking a long time, in almost a comparable time frame in human evolution as it does in development, this isn't crazy. And second, remember, these guys couldn't teach it to each other. Each one of these was a new discovery. The human animal had to discover it the first time out. Whereas when we learn things, it's all the information is already out there in our culture. And it gets transmitted from all the existing info. It's already been discovered. These guys had to discover all this stuff the first time. So it's not such a paradox from a developmental view, I don't think. So what I'm going to do is make some comparisons from cognitive development to cognitive evolution and see if they make some sense here, where we can do some explanation here. First one, this is my research. I have, since my thesis and dissertation work at Northern in 2006, 2007 would have been where I started, so it's 6 years ago already. I had little kids build with blocks. Okay, I was trying to tap into what's their spatial concepts and stuff. And you really can't have kids draw. They don't draw very well until almost age 7 or 8. You know, you'll see that in a minute. So, but they can build. They can construct. So if you get an 18-month-old blocks, okay, most of them won't build anything. They take the blocks and they bang them together in front of you and they throw it across the room and you're a stupid adult. You go pick it up and set it back down and they go, oh, cool. They throw it again. And they laugh, right, and watch it roll. And the adult picks it up, right? That's what you get. Or they chew on it, right? If they build anything, they'll set 2 blocks down for a second and then they pick them right back up again and do something. They don't make anything stable. By age 2, they start building, okay? And right after they start building simple towers and simple lines, okay, and they leave them there, they like make something, they construct. They also start making symmetry. There's 3 types of symmetry. Unless you've studied math or art, you may not know there's 3 types. The first one is the first row, bilateral symmetry. That's anything you can cut and have it equal left and right, okay, mirror symmetry we call it. Then there's translational symmetry, where you have equal elements in a pattern repeated at equal spaces. You can have different blocks in here, or you can have spaces in here, and the spaces are going to be real key. We'll talk about paying attention to space later. The third type of symmetry is just translational symmetry rotated around a point, and we call that radial symmetry. When I give blocks to adults, at first they look at me like I'm goofy, like, yeah, you want me to build with blocks. And then they get into it, and their tongue is going just like a little kid. 60 to 80% of what they build is symmetric. And they don't even know of the other 2 types of symmetry. They might have heard bilateral from 4th grade math. But they make all kinds of examples. Everything they build is symmetric in various ways, loaded with it. Little kids start out making bilateral, and then they add more and more as they get older. Okay? So that's been my research for the last 4 or 5 years. So 18 months and younger, they'll manipulate the blocks, but they don't construct anything. By 2 years old, about 2/3 of them build, but it's just simple lines and stacks. Okay? By 30 months, by 2.5, they all build. And it's a universal. You don't have to teach them to do it, and you can take it anywhere in the world, hand a kid, a 2.5-year-old kid, a pile of blocks. He will build something. He will make a construction without any instruction, without any motivation. You know, they'll just do it. Okay? So by the time you get to even 4 or 5, they name their constructions. They'll tell you what they're making. So it's like they're making something. It's not just stacking blocks together. They're making a thing. Okay? They know what they're doing. It's real interesting. So this is some data. My second study here at MSU, spring of 2011, 54 kids. I went back. I had done younger kids for my thesis, but I only looked at bilateral because I was just starting the examination or investigation into symmetry. So I looked at 2 to 5-year-olds. I gave them a free block play and a copying task. So like you give them 2 blocks at a time, 3 blocks at a time, 4 blocks at a time, let them have each one for a minute because you got to keep them interested too. And it lasts maybe 10 minutes because that's about as long as you can keep a 2 to 3-year-old cooking on any task. And then I give them all the blocks at the end and let them really go to town. So what did we get? Well, what I had seen in some of the pilot and early work is it seemed like the younger kids made bilateral. As they get a little older, they started adding in the other two. And I didn't get my sequence on my dissertation work because my youngest kids were close to 3.5. And I knew I had to go back down to the very first one they start building at age 2, so I did. 60% of them made blocks, 40% didn't, or made constructions, which is what I found before. And if they did make any symmetry, it was only bilateral. There was absolutely no translational, no radial for their first 6 months to a year. Then by 3.5, they all can make bilateral, and they're getting better at constructing. Half of them started making translational, one kid made radial. When you get to 4 to 5 years old, it starts going up. One kid didn't make anything, so that's why it says 90% bilateral. Translational again is around 40, and a couple more started making radial. And I did a copying test too. Is it just that they just didn't think of it, or they can't do it? So we did a test where we made those simple block designs pretty similar to this picture, and we leave it sitting there just like this. And then we give the kid the same 2 blocks and say, here, make this. And the 2 and 2.5-year-olds wouldn't put the block in the middle, right? They'd goof something up. They really had a hard time copying, well, excuse me, they copy bilateral. They have a hard time making these more complex types. They can't even copy them. And a lot of it is they screw up the spaces. They can't arrange the blocks. Even if you've got it sitting right in front of them, they can't make it the same way you can until 3 or 4. Okay, so the 2 to younger kids really had a tough time just even copying blocks the way they're made. Where am I going? Yeah, 2 to 2.5 could. So here's the real data. I'm a psychologist. I got to put one slide with stats on it. This is real simple ANOVAs we do on this stuff, but here's the top one. The mean at 2.5 is 2 things of bilateral. Absolutely no translational radial. And this is a graphic of the same thing. 2 to 3-year-olds start making bilateral. It goes up with age, and there's absolutely no translational radial that comes in later, and it still stays at real low levels until you get into older adults, and that's subject of some other studies. Okay, so back to this. As I was studying the archaeology part, and I've been involved in anthropology since the 70s, and I did my anthropology graduate work in the 80s, I'm going back to it now, and I took a Fossil Humans refresher course, and I started reading the archaeologic literature, and I'm noticing that the first symmetry that shows up at about 200 to 300,000 years ago is these guys, and it's bilateral symmetry. So I'm digging all through the archaeologic stuff. I can't find any evidence, any other kind of symmetry. So the first tools that are symmetric look like this. And they're very intentionally well-made, bilaterally symmetric. You can't make this by accident, believe me, and I'll show you a short video of the guy making tools, you'll see what I mean. Okay? So my question was, the same sequence of symmetric construction that I see in the kids, is that the same as in the archaeologic record? So far, I haven't had this blown out of the water. It looks like it goes bilateral, translational, radial. So we know we've got bilateral at 200,000 years ago. These nice hand X's. I should use your pointer for that, sorry. You don't see any evidence of translational symmetry for almost another 150,000 years. And the first and only evidence we have is from a cave in South Africa, Blundell's Cave, dates to about 70,000 years ago. This is a piece of ochre, and you get these nicely inscribed even lines with even spacing, crosshatch. Nice example of translational symmetry. 150,000 years later, there's nothing before this. Okay? And remember, back at this time, there's no cave art yet. There's no needles. There's no harpoons. Okay, they're not wearing clothes. Nothing. They're not hafting spears yet. Okay, this is a really primitive critter, but the cognition is coming along. Okay, it takes another 40,000 years before you see really excellent examples of translational symmetry in tools where they made each one of these harpoon points the same size element, and they carefully made the spacing. This takes some real work with a stone tool to carve this out of bone or ivory. Okay. Then you finally see radial symmetry come in, also late Paleolithic, around 30,000 years ago. A lot of the cave art that you never see is all kinds of dots and geometric designs. The caves are loaded with them. the coffee table books have the beautiful pictures of the lions and the this and that. You don't see the lousy artwork where some guy started drawing a lion and he messed it up and the guy was, you know, you see all levels of drawing skill in the caves, but you don't see that in the coffee table books. They don't want to show you the schmucks that they're drawing. So you got radial symmetry, you get examples of that. So it looks like we've got a similar sequence. Okay, so that was the first comparison from cognitive development. I'm going to do this briefly. This is one of my favorite authors in cognitive development, a lady named Jean Mandler. She wrote a book called The Foundations of Mind, based on 30 years of her research. And a lot of her theory here is drawn on modern cognitive psychology. So we wouldn't have any of this without all the work that's been done in the last 20, 30 years. The way infants figure out what you are, they're wired to look at movement, they're wired to look at high contrast, okay? And they're wired to look at faces and this and that. But they understand based on spatial relations and movement. So if something moves by itself without being pushed, that's animals or people. Those are animate things, okay? And we can do tests with them that they categorize that way. It might take hours to go into it. If something doesn't move by itself, it has to be either thrown or pushed or propelled in some way. Things that don't move under their own power and don't act contingently with you, those are objects, inanimate things. That's how they cut up the world, based on these spatial primitives, okay? So the first concepts in both development and cognitive evolution seem to be spatial ones. There's another thing I can get into spatial metaphor. Almost all of the abstract thoughts that we use are based in spatial metaphor, and I'll give you a short one, okay, which I just did, right? I'm going to give you an idea. There's no idea in my hand, and I'm not transferring anything, right? Or I'm going to put it into words. Put it in, you know, it's a container metaphor, okay? So if I can grasp my thoughts, right, as if I can hold a thought. Again, there's no thought to hold, right? And convey them to you, right? Transfer them, right? Or if I can put them into words, and you know, if you study that literature, it's really interesting. Everything is based on space and force metaphors. It's really interesting. So, one of the things you find out in cognitive development is some concepts are implicit, that we do them, but we're not consciously aware of how we do it, okay? And later on, that concept may become explicit to us, that we can talk about it and figure out what we've been doing all along, okay? So implicit usually comes first in development, explicit much later. Example, I probably did this one before. I don't want to use your, I can use my phone. It's okay, don't tell me about it. Right? You show a kid a video, what am I doing? You show a kid, 9-month-old child that can't talk yet. Show him a video of one thing sliding down a ramp, hits the other one, and the other one propels. He looks at that, okay. Show it to him a couple times, he starts getting bored with it, looks away after 3 or 4 seconds. Then you show him another video where the thing comes down the ramp and it stops short, like an inch or two away, no contact. And then this thing takes off anyways. They will stare at that, like, you know, and they do, they dishabituate to it, they will stare at it. We can do all kinds of studies like this where it's like they have a intuitive understanding of paying attention to the world, okay, of propulsion, that objects don't move by themselves. Kitty does, little brother does, and then when you pick Kitty up, Kitty acts contingently with you and moves and scratches and does things. You pick up an object, and they're doing it, okay? They catch on to those movements, okay? The other one is support. I'll show you that real quick. This is all from developmental psych. Oh, let's go to this one. No, let's start with this one. We put a nice space on it so you can get a 3-month-old to look at the damn thing, right? You know, because a 3-month-old is in the, you know, looks like one of your roommates on Friday night, right? That's experience is kind of out there. If you show a 3-month-old this, or a 2-month-old, let's say, this doesn't bother him, okay? But even a 3-month-old will look at this and he'll stare at this, that this thing isn't sitting on here. He'll habituate to it and get bored with it. But then if you show him, you know, a cartoon like this where this object is hanging out in the middle of the space, the kid will stare at it Okay, this is like a violation of expectancy. It's like they have an intuitive physics now that objects don't just hang out in the middle of somewhere. They got to be supported on something. Okay, they get better with it with age. At 6.5 months, the 3-month-old, as long as it's touching, good enough. Okay, but the 6 to 7-month-old will look at this and go, that ain't right, and we all know that, right? That if it's not fully supported, it's going to fall off, and you're going to look at it like that's an impossible event. Okay. So I won't go into all the details, but you get the idea. What's interesting is those are implicit concepts. The kid doesn't know anything about gravity. He doesn't know anything about balance, right? The propulsion part, he doesn't know force equals mass times acceleration, right? He doesn't know what is it, the first law? What's inertia? We were just talking about. Second law, okay. 9-month-old infant doesn't know anything about the second law, but he implicitly understands that objects need to be propelled to take off again. They should sit there, right? Here's a better one. Language rules. And I might have done this with you. I've done this so many times I can't remember. Okay, all of us learn a gazillion language rules, age 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? Most of them, unless you take a linguistics, phonics course, you'll never know what they are. So for example, how do you make a plural?
Depends on language.
Right. English.
S or ES.
S. Okay? But you learned a rule how to pronounce that S. Then unless I quiz you on it, you won't do it. But you'll do the rule right every time. You've got that rule implicitly built into your brain. If it's a hard consonant, make it a Z. If it's a soft consonant, keep it an S. So you all say cats, but you all say dogs. Make the Z sound. Nobody taught you that. Mom didn't come along one day and say, Johnny, you've been saying dogs lately, and I'm not very happy with you. Make the Z sound when you talk about 2 dogs. Please, you know, you're embarrassing the name. Nobody does that. The kid hears it, picks it up. Those are implicit type pattern recognition, and I could do hundreds of examples of that kind of thing in cognitive development. Only later do those concepts ever become explicit. So again, go back to this stuff, just because these guys could make something bilaterally symmetric and this was aesthetically pleasing to them and they could figure it out, doesn't mean they had the explicit concept where the guy could say, yeah, this is bilateral symmetry and it's only one of the 3 types of symmetry. We don't even know how much they were talking at 200,000 years ago. It was probably starting, but they weren't probably completely verbal like us, okay? So he could make this, and whether he had a term for left and right, he must have had an implicit concept to keep this side different from this side, okay? And he had an implicit concept of midline. And more importantly, when I watch these tool makers make stuff, when you start out with a rock, the edges are like this. There is no edge. If you want an edge to look like this, you got to chip all this away and somehow keep this line when you're done. That's the real trick. That's amazing when those guys do that. So what you have to do is think of a center line going through the tool transversely there, and you keep bringing the edge back to that center line. That's the only way you make a tool like this. That's phenomenal cognitive skill. Believe me, no ape or no crow is ever going to pull that one off. Okay, you got to have the concepts of this, even if they're explicit and you can't talk about them yet. And that makes sense too. That they did this, but they didn't discover translational symmetry for another 150,000 years. None of these concepts were explicit then, and they had to discover it the first time. So, from the developmental standpoint, it doesn't seem so crazy. Maybe evolution follows a similar path. So now I'll go back to Jeannie Mandler real briefly. Spatial relations involved in events rather than the physical appearance of objects are conceptually privileged, meaning that we know what objects look like to identify them, which any chimp or any animal can do. They can identify, you know, different animals. Oh, you're a chimp like me, or this and that. But it's the conceptual spatial movements that gives them their meaning, okay? So 2 primitives form the bedrock of animal. An animal is something that moves by itself, not like an object that doesn't move, and it interacts in a contingent way with other things. And that's how kids build their first concepts of animals and stuff using spatial stuff. Okay? And this knowledge is implicit for years, a long time before it becomes explicit. Okay. So it took 40,000 years to go from somebody inscribing translational symmetry, we see none of this in tools or anything else. It takes another 40,000 years before you see guys making translational symmetry in tools and stuff. This might be the first time, and the guy was just, you know, and he made them equal because he's been making things equal on tools for 1 million years almost, or 500,000. But this is very deliberate. This is planned. This is worked out. Okay? So it took a while for this to be something we could do, and that we could do it on other substrates. Back here, this bone fragment is one of the few things. There's no bone tools yet. There's no nothing. You know, we've got one inscription and a piece of ochre, which is actually, you know, rock, right? So we don't have bones, we don't have antler, we don't have ivory, anything till down at this time. Okay. That's my 10. 8. Okay. Next comparison is drawing, and I just went and met one of the drawing instructors here in the art department. I had an fantastic conversation with the guy.
Dale Lace?
Yeah, Dale Lace, thank you.
Yes.
Interesting talk. There's a theory of drawing skills of, it's called the, I forgot the name of the Conceptions of Children's Drawing or something, by a guy named Jay Willits. And the old days we used to think we all had a picture of something in our head, okay, like an image. Somewhere, you had the old Cartesian theater, right? The screen somewhere in your head. And you read off that screen, and just little kids are worse at reading off the screen than us adults are, and that's why kids don't draw so good, okay? Nowadays, nobody thinks there's an image in the head. The way that we construct our knowledge of things around us, we start picking up on the features and their spatial relations, and it's stored in like a descriptive representation. There's no picture. Now, when you think of something image-like, you do call up sort of an image sketch in your working memory, but again, it's not a veridical picture. It's not a snapshot of whatever it is you're thinking of or going to draw, okay? So it takes a long time for children to accumulate all those spatial relations, knowledge of features and objects. What Dale pointed out to me is he said one of the key things to draw well is you have to look at the negative space. You must pay attention to the spaces. They're as important as the objects you're drawing. If you don't get the spaces right, your drawings, it won't be very representational at all, okay? So children have incomplete representations. They have to build those detailed representations over, you know, age 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then maybe you take drawing classes for a year, and then you might be able to draw a decent, you know, portrait of some kind. Did the hominins go through the same thing? Well, here's what we got. In kids age 3 and 4 make these. I still draw this bad. I can draw blood and I can draw flies. That's about it. Okay. They made tadpole drawings. You know, it's a grenade type joke. It takes a while to go off, right? They get the trunks all wrong, the spatial relations are all messed up. They just put some sticks, you know, coming out. This is what it looks like, right? This takes, you know, from age 3 to 4, you can maybe get a decent 12-year-old with some training to come out with something, but not even as good as this, right? It takes a lot of knowledge and training to get to here. And how do you do it? You don't just think about it, right? You practice looking at, you know, when they have a nude figure or a still life, right? You stare at that thing and redraw it for hours and redraw it and redraw it. You're building all that spatial and featural knowledge, okay? It takes a long time. Well, what's interesting, the late Paleolithic cave art shows up when we were hunting Ice Age mammals in Europe during the last Ice Age about 40,000 years ago. There might be some differences in this hunting than to how everybody hunted or scavenged for the previous 2 million years. When you were back in Africa on the savannah, a lot of large mammals, a lot of stuff to scavenge. They weren't as intensively hunting large mammals. When the Ice Age hit and the modern humans were in the Ice Age in southern Europe, okay, their way of life was a very intensive large mammal hunting way of life. That's what they hunted. They were doing this kind of stuff. Reindeer, mammoth, oryx, which is the precursor of cattle, okay? There were woolly rhinoceros. There were lions back then, cave bears and regular bears. There are all these large mammals, and that's mainly what they hunted, okay? And you get this type of intensive, observational, probably tracking type hunting. And sure enough, you get this beautiful cave art. And you never see anything like that before, okay? So here's Ice Age Europe. Here's a little picture of a hunter with a hafted spear point. Here's the ice sheet. And so all this part of France, Spain, Italy, across in here, where we find 400 different sites of cave and open air sites of this marvelous cave art that you don't find in Africa. You get stick figures in Africa, okay? All of it happens here, and this is more like the Russian steppe is now. It's cold and it's dry, okay? It's almost like hunting up in Fairbanks, Alaska. You know, moose and caribou, big mammals, okay? And in order to hunt them, they had to stalk and lie in wait hours. They had to really get to know these creatures, okay? So it's interesting that 70,000 years ago, we got this simple inscribed lines. We have absolutely nothing in between. And all of a sudden, if you go to the movie tomorrow night, the oldest cave is about 32 to 38,000 years ago, and that's that Chauvet cave that's in the movie tomorrow night. All of a sudden, you get this stuff, where they've got the whiskers right, they've got the mane and winter right, they've got the summer look right, they've got the postures right, okay? Most of the cave art is all large mammals, and a good portion of them are bleeding, they're speared, okay? And you don't see any bunny rabbits, no flowers, no landscapes, no picture of everybody sitting around the hearth, right? I mean, these guys could draw. These are fantastic, right? This is an incredible artistic skill. Now, not everybody was that good. There's some crappy art there, too, okay? But it's almost all Ice Age mammals that they hunted, big mammals. Like I said, very few birds, a couple fish, but no, you know, landscape scenes, no pictures of the village, no pictures of the family sitting around a campfire, no picture, hardly any pictures of each other, hardly any pictures of humans. All animals in an exquisite detail, like this one. This one's been speared. The tail is up. When an animal is either frightened or it's been shot or stabbed or something, the tail goes up. They often defecate. You'll see a lot of things where they're defecating. Here's the spear. It went through here. The intestines are under pressure and the intestines are coming out, right? And then a lot of the pictures show if you got a lung shot, the thing is spewing blood out of its mouth, which is how they die, okay? So you get this incredible detail. And here's a picture of a human. It's a stick figure. And if you get any humans represented, they're all stick figures. There's a few faces, very few, like less than 1% of the art is faces. And when you do, it's no better than like a 7-year-old kid drawing kind of a, you know, a sketchy outline. Yet this stuff, look at this.
Look at the hind legs. Look at the hind legs on the
yeah, it's even got the forelocks or whatever you call it, stuff like that. The detail on some are incredible. Yes, ma'am.
It could mean that the bull, whatever it is, has killed the man, and then they had to kill the bull.
Maybe. Maybe. Or the bull is wounded and is charging Junior here because here's his spear thrower laying on the ground. Right? He speared the thing. He wants to get it hard and long because that's going to kill it. He hit it back here. The thing is pissed off and it ain't dead yet. It comes at him. He drops his atlatl right here. And birds hang around these type of grazing animals sitting on the ground. So the bird thing is probably not something, you know, symbolic or shamanistic. It's just, you know, a realistic scene. But you go from almost no artwork skill here, and 30,000 years later, representational art. So I'm looking at it like, well, why? Well,
are they bringing the children into the caves to show them what to look for when they go outside?
Most of the people that visited the caves and left handprints are all 90% adolescent males. Okay, they're all, and most of the imagery is either the mammals, right, or a lot of porn. Okay, that you don't see in the art books either. Female vulvas, female figures with the exaggerated breasts, all over the place. Okay, but you don't see those in the books. It gets a little repetitious actually. There's a 500-page book. It's in my references down here in the library called "The Nature of Paleolithic Art." It's phenomenal because it covers all this stuff that you don't normally hear about. So what I'm saying is, I don't think it's a coincidence that when modern human hunters had to invent this intensive large mammal hunting because of the Ice Age climate. It wasn't like the old plains in tropical Africa where there was a million zebra and antelope around and you pretty much skewer one with a thrusting spear, or there's a carcass of an animal and you chase the vultures away with a rock or something and you get what's left over, or the lions are done and you get one of the leg bones and the skull and you deflesh it. Okay, that was their way of living for a couple million years, but when they got to Ice Age Europe, they had to get really good at tracking and following these animals, and their knowledge of these animals, in order to pull this off, they had to do this for hours. You know, they lied in wait, just waiting for the herd to get 10 feet closer, so I can get it within spear distance, or I can get them and then you can get the second one in. These weren't high-powered rifles. The animals don't just drop and die and you wait a few minutes and go pick up your deer 50 yards away, right? These suckers, you might have to track these for 2-3 days. So again, if you know their habits, you know the animal's cold, okay? So I'm thinking all that incredible featural knowledge got built in during those times, and that's why they developed that level of art, not before. Thinking it's a nice tie-in, I don't know. We'll see. Last comparison, developmental, and I'll quit in a few minutes. The main developmental psychologist, cognitive developmentalist, is Jean Piaget. He's a Swiss guy, psychologist. He started out as a biologist, good guy. He didn't come from the, I'm sorry, I'm going to say this out loud. He didn't come from the humanities angle, he came from the science angle. Child is a little scientist. That's the way he looked at the human animal, just like he'd study any other kind of animal. And his whole pitch is children have to construct their knowledge by interacting with the world. Like I said, if you take a little kid and you give him blocks, he's chewing on them, he's figuring the texture out with his fingers, he's manipulating, he's looking at them, he's turning them over, he brings them to his visual field so he can inspect them, he throws them and sees how far they roll, he hears the sound. He's doing all this experimentation that Piaget documented. Exploration of things is built into the human animal. The human infant is a little learning machine. It's an information sponge, and you don't have to teach it to learn. He doesn't have to learn. It's built in. Give you an example. Take a 18-month-old kid and an 18-month to 2-year-old chimp. Okay? Get the Fisher-Price toy with the wheel and the shifter, the key. It's got a thing for the horn, right? Hand it to the kid. You don't have to sit down and go, okay, Johnny, now I have to teach you how to play with this, okay? I want you to, you don't do anything, just hand it to him. What does he do? He sits down, within 5 minutes he will figure out, he will try every one of those things and he will figure out how each piece works and the sound it makes. He will explore it all on his own without any impulse or motivation or training. He just does it.
I think that's a biased study. He's already seen the parents drive around. Why don't you put both of them
give him something else.
in an environment that's never been seen by a chimp and never been seen by a human?
Oh, we could do that. They've done similar to that with blocks.
Go to an ocean shore or something.
Okay.
You know, and you got a piles of seaweed and stones and driftwood and crabs and shit that neither.
The chimp won't sit there for 5 minutes manipulating, right? If you give the chimp the Fisher-Price toy or the piece of driftwood, he'll be up a rope or up the side of a chain link fence, 20 feet in a heartbeat. And he'll probably throw it off the top, run back down, get it again, and go up. And I've seen bonobos at the Milwaukee Zoo go up a chain link fence that's 20 feet high, and then they walk up along the top of the thing like you and I would stroll down the sidewalk. They don't even, do this to balance. Shit. They just go. Okay. Their physical skills are, completely mature compared to an 18-month-old that can barely walk straight, right? But their exploration skills never go beyond throwing the thing around. You'll never see a chimp sit there for 5 minutes and work each of the pieces. You might be able to teach him that if you can get him to pay attention that long, but it's pretty tough. It takes a long, long time. Okay, so exploration is one part. The next is construction. All kids start to build at 2, 2.5. You don't have to tell them to do it. It's worldwide. There's been studies in, like primitive cultures, and you give them objects and blocks, and they combine them just like a kid in a developed country would. Okay, so the whole deal is observing and investigating with the hands. So I think tool use alone wasn't enough. You needed tool manufacture. We had to start constructing things. Whether these concepts were implicit or explicit to begin with, in order to do these things, if you're going to knock this thing off and then this thing off, you've at least got to have a rudimentary concept of next to. So even the early tools of 2.5 million years ago, most of these tools were made that if they knocked one flake off, they wouldn't knock the next one off over here or over here. They would always make them contiguous. So they got the idea of next to. You have to teach that to a chimp, okay? And chimps also don't get the flaking angle, which they don't have the mechanics for it, but they don't understand the cognition of the angle either. Because in order to knock a flake off the stone, you cannot hit it flat on the edge, or you can't hit it on a rounded edge. You'll never break it. You got to look for a sharp edge like this, and you've got to hit it at an oblique angle and a very glancing blow. It's really quite a trick, just to even make something as simple as this. And that's what the study I just did gets into. I think we would have developed concepts like left, right, middle, equal, symmetry developed out of all this, didn't develop out of anything else. There is no other artifacts then, other than wooden spears and maybe digging sticks. Okay? Again, no needles, no bones, nothing else while all this was developing. The other thing that I think is really important is down here, is the first evidence of real abstraction. And that's a study I'm coding right now that I'm trying to get into. When do kids really pay attention to the spaces? Remember I said in drawing, the space is everything? When does a kid naturally look at the spaces? I got an inkling of that in that first study where the kids couldn't copy the spaces between blocks at 2, 2.5, but I was trying to see, I wanted to see more. So we did a study last spring where we did a lot more spatial manipulation, and we even did it in the auditory channel with doing a drum beat. When did they notice the spaces in between? When can they copy them? Okay? This is important here. When you make a stone tool, every rock starts out randomly shaped. No two rocks are the same. So you can't just follow an algorithm like, I'm going to hit this 75 times, turn it over 12 times, do these 3 hits, then those 4 hits, then these 3 hits, 4 hits, and I'll end up with this. It doesn't work. It's like sculpting. We call this, to go from a chunk of rock like this to something like this, and I'll show you a video in a second, is a reduction sequence. You got to reduce this big stone, or let's say you started out with this blank, and you worked it down to this beautiful piece. Okay? Just to get to this from this takes a load of skill, but then to go from this down to this is amazing. Okay? When you do this, because the rock is not equal on equal sides, you can't just say, well, I just took a big chunk off here, right? So if I want this side to look the same, I'll take the same big chunk off here and it'll be equal. You can't, because the rock is differently shaped. What you have to do is equalize the spaces. What you're basically doing is, I'm going to take a bigger chunk off here, a smaller chunk off here, to equalize what's missing, to equalize what's left. So you're really putting the frame around space and treating it as if it was another object. That's a huge conceptual leap. No animal, I don't think, can do that. Love to get into chimps and try and test that. They have done studies with chimps building with blocks, and chimps don't make anything, they never make any symmetry. Maybe they'll set 2 blocks down at a time in their big hands, and maybe they'll stack. You can maybe teach a chimp to stack 3, 4 blocks, then he knocks them all down and runs away. They never sit down and construct, okay? So I think a lot of these, a lot of the things we take for granted in our conceptual stuff may have come out of tool making. And I think, yeah, I left this video up. I'm just going to show you this briefly. This is one of the guys making a tool, and he'll tell you a little bit about what he's going to do, and I'll just jump ahead. I'll just jump in there now. Yeah. All right, this is A4, Andrew's second early echelon hand axe. And instead of coming out of taking a big flake off of, what do you call it, core or cobble?
Yeah, instead of taking like off a big core, someone has actually removed this flake for me already, so I picked it up and I'm going to use that. I'm going to drop my hands so bad.
Just going to tape all the bark like edges, blended edge, and end up with something like this.
This is some, but this shirt actually probably plays a little bit better than that last this one from out.
Okay, if I can be picky, see if we can get closer to this one on the left. Make it look something like that.
Okay, more pointed. Okay, some of the same ideas as we saw in the last one. You know, I can look around here and see where my problems are. I got all this flat edge up here, so I may have to use some tricks, alternate flake to kind of get this edge prepared. Got kind of thinner over this direction, but that's, you know, obviously a good place to start. This is my platform set up here, or angled edge. So I'm just going to jump in again. I've got
You already know where the button, the point end is.
20 ends up here, butt ends up here.
But that's another concept. You gotta know which end's gonna look like what.
Some of this will come off and
Yeah.
dip around. Okay.
Yeah. I'll take it back. Where the point is on here is going to point it in, and I've got rounded end there, so that'll be my butt end.
Okay.
You go back and you're looking at these, you'll notice in some cases, you know, like on that, we're much more steeper angle to kind of get that platform down, where then now I'm going to take, drop the angle up instead of being straight across, it's more up and down. So that's a couple things that you got to know to be making these. And again, flakes coming off here certainly could be used as tools in on this.
Yeah, very sure.
Go between
Get
on that edge. I've got most of
jump
them
ahead
off
of
this
the
little
spots.
board. I'll have the rest of that edge.
Pretty soon we'll have all the brown weathered part gone. Which is the point? Which is the butt?
Point is up here.
Yep. Okay. We get that stuff
And you
peeled
see
off.
now,
It's really tricky.
You know, I can always take flakes off this side, or I can flip it, take a flake off there, kind of thing. But then I can shape it. That's an important distinction there. That's not a beginner technique. I mean, you can certainly, once you show it to someone, they kind of get the idea.
To get rid of that flat edge?
To get rid of that flat edge. That's that.
Yeah, I still don't know what you mean. I've got about half of that where it makes sense to me. I know what you're doing, but yeah, that takes a while, unless you've done it.
Okay, this is a good example. I'm refit this flake back here.
Okay.
If you look at this edge, it's almost straight up and down. So you can't go straight in. It'd be like banging your head against the wall.
That's got to get peeled off.
You've got to, and so what I've done, and you can, and this is a good example here, you can actually see on here where I've taken a flake this way, then this
Then
way,
that way.
and then I flip it over,
And then
you look at this edge, okay, it's below center line now, it's not straight up and down, I can take that flake off.
That's the key point. You have to have that concept that you're trying to see a center line and bring everything to that edge to create this edge. You've got to already see the center line in this rock, and I knock this piece off, this piece off, this piece off, and I'll end up with this edge like this. It's really tricky. It's really pretty amazing. And there's been tons of replication studies done like this. Okay, but everybody just looks at the size of the flakes and the stone. It's an archaeological approach. Nobody's looked at it from the conceptual standpoint. And this is incredible. So we're going to code all this verbal protocol and try and analyze the different concepts that are there and make some comments. Is it tougher to make this tool versus that tool? What do you need to know to make that basic one that you don't need to know, but you gotta need to know for the one a million years later? What did they, everybody looks at these and says, well, they were smarter here and smarter here, but nobody defines smarter. Well, what does smarter mean? Well, here all you need to know is a flaking angle and put them next to each other, and you got flakes and a chopper. A million years later, you've got to maintain an edge. That's some serious work. And then later, you got to get the symmetry and some really fine thinning and stuff. So I'll just show you at the end of this. I'll jump ahead so you can see that they could easily break. What he started with, this is looking pretty much like that hand axe
now,
there.
when they're thicker like this, it's not as easy to break, but you still do run that risk.
Now this is nicer stone than what you were looking at there. The first hand axe was more grainier like this, similar to that basalt or whatever it might have been.
Correct.
This is a little better stuff.
Yeah, they're both churns. This is a little bit finer grain churn. It's a bit better feeling and stuff.
Right.
But just
Once you do.
just looking at it, it seems that
It's not as hard. It's softer. It sticks a little more and you transfer a little more force without having to hit it as hard.
yeah, there's some fracture mechanics literature on that.
Is it? Yeah, okay.
Check it out.
was just
I
like,
get the
I
idea.
can see
Moldavite Gorge, that's pretty much,
earlier excavations and
that's pretty much it.
it's like, oh,
Put this off. So, I'm not gonna go into the rest of it, I've got another, why can't I get it up there? Let's do it. Have to do this bit?
Something dragged into the morning.
Yeah.
There we go. I'll stop at the developmental things. I've got actually around half a dozen slides where we can look at cognitive psychological approaches that make sense of all this. There's just some phenomenal stuff in here, but I'll jump all that, just talk about tracking briefly. There's an excellent book called The Art of Tracking, The Origin of Science. And we think to hunt these large Ice Age mammals, they were probably doing some tracking because, like I said, you don't kill the animal right away. It's going to take a while for this thing to die. If you don't know how to go find it and track it, you know, you just lost dinner. So they got good at tracking, and what tracking is, when if you read any of the literature of modern hunter-gatherers, and they see an animal print like this, they'll tell from the time of day how much sand is blown into the track, right? Whether one foot looks like it didn't go in as far, like, you know, that's where I hit him and he's kind of favoring that foot. They will infer all sorts of things. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. So they argue back and forth, and the guy says, well, I think they went that way and they're heading toward the water hole, you know, and it's pretty fresh because there isn't much sand in there and this is still wet. And boy, he was pushing pretty hard with his back feet, so he was walking real steady. He wasn't running up on his toes, you know, all this stuff. So it wasn't that long ago and he wasn't running, so let's go down there and go find him. They go down to the water hole, the thing isn't there, right? And the other guy said, well, I don't think so because the sun is kind of high, it would have dried out. He's heading for the heavy cover to get out of the hot noonday sun, which large animals do, and they go over there and they find it. So what is that? That's inference, right? Hypothesis and testing, whoop, wrong, good science, right? You learn you're wrong, and then you figure out you're right. So this book, The Origin of Science, Art of Tracking, is just excellent. And he says that's probably where we learn to make inferences about the real world and build that kind of thinking was from animal tracking. So I'll finish, this is my last slide. Most people that are studying human evolution, and they're studying primates, they all take the approach that it was our social interactions that built the human mind, okay? That we learned to read each other's thoughts, you know, theory of mind, and communicate, look at each other's gaze. And I think all that's true. And imitative learning, we do that 10 times better than apes. Apes really don't teach each other much of anything, whereas everything we do is teaching the younger to do things, okay? That's what humanity is all about. I think they got it backwards. This is Michael Tomasello, who's one of the leading researchers in the field, phenomenal researcher. I don't know if the guy sleeps. He's got hundreds of articles, books. The guy's amazing, phenomenal. But his book, I've got a copy of this book in my office, and it's The Cultural Origin of Human Cognition, and the book is filled with angry notes all over the place. I think he's got it completely ass backwards. I think they all do. It's the cognitive origin of human culture. We developed our conceptual abilities through this, long before there was any human culture. And we had to build all these concepts step by step, just like a kid does through cognitive development. They didn't just suddenly fall out of the sky. We had to construct them and build them. And then we had to make them explicit instead of implicit, just like a kid does. And then we took that incredible conceptual ability and we pasted it onto the already existing, very social, highly social interactions of primates. Okay? And one of the reasons I don't think social interplay caused our thinking and our language to happen is because chimps and other primates, but chimps especially, have incredible Machiavellian social intrigues. When they're not grooming or eating, okay, and the 2 times a year that they're screwing for maybe a few days when the females are in heat, the rest of the time they're forming alliances, holding grudges, getting even, doing dominance hierarchy things. They remember that this guy was head of the troop 6 years ago and he aligns with this guy and we finally knock him out. Just incredible social interactions. But they don't talk. They don't make nothing. Okay? Some chimps learn to chimp rocks or
Like nuts.
Yeah, thank you. Crack nuts. The next troop of chimps 400 miles away doesn't know how to do that. They might have learned how to termite fish, but these guys don't. So there's no species-wide cultural transmission and learning, okay? There's no talking. They gain very little eye contact. So now if you take this human level of cognition and conceptual skill and then paste that onto primate interactions, you get kin relations and tribal relations. A chimp may remember that you beat him up last week and he's wary of you, okay? And he may stay closer to his mother or his little sister kin-wise, but he doesn't know this guy over here is his third uncle once removed, and that's his cousin, and I'm Joe, son of Jim, who was head of the troop. He doesn't have any of that conceptual stuff pasted on top of it. They have no knowledge of any of that stuff. Okay, that we're pretty sure about, okay? So I don't think primate social cognition was the driving force for human cognition. I think it was tool manufacture. We had to build it through tool making and taking the world apart and putting it back together. So I think it's the cognitive origin of human culture. Hopefully I'll write that book, but that's a few years down the road. And that's it. So thank you. Question?
You mentioned earlier about how infants derive whether or not something is a living thing by looking about whether or not it has autonomous motion. What would an infant think of a motorized toy?
There's actually some developmental work on that right now, where kids will be surprised when they first see something move that they don't expect it to move. Then after a while, they realize, oh, somehow it moves by itself, but then they still don't treat it like a living thing because unless it's a really good, avatar type robot, right? Where you can fool a kid into thinking this is a live thing, he'll still treat it differently. I'll give you a great example. There's one developmental study where they have a machine, and you can see the machine grips this thing and it looks like a dumbbell, and it's trying to pull the end off. So you can see it's trying to yank the end off. And the kid will watch that and he won't imitate it. Then you have a person come and do the same thing, and the person's like, and they're trying, to pull the end off the side, but they can't do it. You give the thing to the kid will imitate the person, but not the machine. Okay? It's like they know it's different. But I imagine as our robots get bigger and bigger, it's going to, and I know there's work being done, I haven't read that literature recently, to see what they do, how well we can fool them. But they understand plants. They really don't understand plants or living things until a lot later. That takes like age 3 and 4 and 5, where kids start to understand that all living things have guts inside of them, but the ball doesn't, or the rock doesn't. There's no guts in here. And when you break the rock, right, it doesn't heal, but Kitty heals, and little brother heals. I hit him in the head with a hammer the other day. Now he's better a week later. They catch on to that stuff. But that the rock doesn't change. It doesn't have any guts. It doesn't grow, but little brother grows, right? So, and that stuff comes on stream like, again, age 3, 4, 5, and beyond, stuff like that.
There are university level students who don't know the plants are alive, so.
Yeah, believe it. I believe it.